We are live now. Hello, thanks for joining the program. I'm Elizabeth Reetz. I'm here with Lynn Alex tonight. This is the first program in a series that we're doing for Iowa Archaeology Month 2020. And it is just sort of an unscripted conversation between friends. Throughout the 5 weeks of Iowa Archaeology Month, a different archaeologist will be reviewing a now retired archaeologist who they admire, who they were mentored by, or who they just want to learn more about. And when this idea was proposed by the Iowa Archaeological Society, I immediately wanted to interview Lynn Alex. So Lynn is my predecessor. I am currently the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Office of the State Archaeologist, which is a really fancy title for saying I was hired as the Director of Education and Outreach in 2013. And this is a job that Lynn retired from in 2013. Yeah. So I really appreciate you being here, Lynn. It's been wonderful to practice this with you. And we'll just let everyone know. I can't tell yet if people are watching. But I met Lynn, of course, when she retired, and we did get to interact on some projects. And some of those projects involved wine. So it's 6 p.m. You know, the workday is done. So Lynn and I are enjoying a glass of wine together here as friends, which I think is fitting because some of the first work that we did with each other was we'd had a book tour for the Archaeological Guide to Iowa, which Lynn was a co-author of in 2015. So we organized a book tour at different places across Iowa and strategically had some of those presentations at wineries across Iowa.
I think one of them we stayed at was a winery.
We did stay at a winery,
right.
Yeah,
that was a pleasant way to come back to Iowa and do a book tour.
So I brought Lynn back from retirement to drink some wine with me while we traveled across Iowa. And we got to see some beautiful places in Western Iowa, in Northwest Iowa, Northeast Iowa. So that's been one of the highlights for me the last 7 years, Lynn. And we've also done some project archaeology traveling together. So we've been to Colorado together, to the Southwest and Montana, and definitely drank our share of wine at those meetings.
That's right.
As well.
That's part of the appeal. That's very good. Yep.
And so it is Iowa Archaeology Month. And you said that you started your career about the same time our Iowa Archaeology Week was founded or signed as a proclamation. Yeah. So, well, you have been an archaeologist for a long time, but you started in your education position at the OSA.
That's right, in 99. That's
1999. Correct. So that's the same year Iowa Archaeology Month became a thing.
Yeah, it had been Archaeology Week, and I've gotten a little bit of fuzzy on the chronology, but it was a week, and then it went to a month. And in 99, Bill Green, our former state archaeologist, was able to get a governor's proclamation declaring the event, and Governor Vilsack was the governor then, and he signed it. And so we really ramped it up beginning that year, and then every year after that, it took on a new form, and you know, some years was very busy with activities all across the state. We had a poster for probably a decade, and that was always quite popular. We had a lot of partnerships. That's the way we could carry it off, I think. I think the novelty of it to start with was a boost for the whole thing. That was something that had never really been done. Iowa had done a lot of, really had done quite a bit of archaeological education, starting back with, I will say with the state archaeologists, with McCusick even. But Bill Green hired me on as the first person that was sort of hired in a position to do education in archaeology. And that was, I'd done presentations before that. When we were in South Dakota, I was a visiting scientist to the schools when I taught at the South Dakota School of Mines and Technology. But this was the first position that OSA had in the field.
Yeah, and Iowa was incredibly forward thinking with creating that position, because that was 1999. And now in 2020, there are still very few institutionalized archaeology education positions at organizations across the country. So yeah.
I think that I've always felt that having this institutional position for it, especially at a university, was a real asset, because not only did we have researchers, not only at the OSA, at the university, but it gave a legitimacy to archaeology education by having that university and state archaeologist office as the home place for the archaeological educator. And that's rare, as you know, across the country.
Yeah, it's incredibly rare. And it's, I feel so lucky having landed this position. It really is a dream job. And I honestly can't count how many times I've been told, like, wow, you've got really big shoes to fill with Lynn Alex's position. And for a long time, I was known as the new Lynn Alex, or this is the person who took Lynn Alex's job. I think people know my name now. I'm not really sure, but things are a little bit different. So when, as you mentioned, Iowa Archaeology Month, when it first started, there was a lot of momentum. There was a poster. Some states still do their Iowa Archaeology Month posters, but the expense of that, and especially the expense of printing and shipping that, has been a barrier. And I feel like Iowa Archaeology Month every year sort of stresses me out a little bit. I find a lot of challenges with trying to get events off the ground because of lack of funding and honestly lack of statewide partners. So what was it like for you to organize an Iowa Archaeology Month?
Well, it was always a challenge. I mean, obviously, it initially started somewhat small, although pretty quickly we got into a system of trying to bring in as many organizations as possible, not only in terms of their interests, the schools, for instance, the county conservation boards, local and state museum, obviously the Iowa Archaeological Society, libraries. So we had a huge mailing list that we developed, and then we had to thank largely Linda Langenberg, secretary, for setting out the notices every year. And we tried to, I would say, two things. We tried to look at subject areas within Iowa archaeology that we thought people were interested in. Sometimes it would be based on maybe a project that had been big that year or something. But I always felt that my role in terms of the Archaeology Month, but also in all the archaeology education that we did, was kind of quality control. We were coming from a university organization. We had the research behind us. And so I felt it was my job to translate that for the public, that largely a translator, but we had good research and I wanted to be authentic to that research. So it was a challenge not only to get the word out, but then the funding was a big challenge. And so one thing I had to learn quickly, I had never done before, was grant writing. I'd never done any grant writing that I can think of. I think the first grant writing I did for the position was we brought in, and I'm going to forget his name right now, but he was a Neanderthal expert. And we had him come to the University of Iowa as a public event to talk about some new Neanderthal remains from Spain that showed a relationship between the subspecies then of Neanderthalensis and Homo sapiens sapiens. It looks like they had interbred. And at the time, that was highly debated. And we made it a public event. I got a tiny grant from the Chamber of Commerce in Iowa City to bring him in. It was under $500. And that was the first one I wrote. And then after that, every year, any project that we did, whether it was Archaeology Month, whether it was actual products like our teaching capsules, whether it was pamphlets. One of the first ones we did was integrating archaeology and science. We always had to get grant money for it. That did not come from the university. My position throughout my whole career was part-time. It was only on occasion when there would be a larger project that we could tap the archaeology education into, or fit it into, or have an educational product that came out of it, that the degree of effort on my part would go up to 100%. So that grant writing just became key every year. I don't know how many grants I would write every year. And Humanities Iowa was a big grantee for Iowa Archaeology Month every year. But then our partners would come in with amounts, and they would also come in with what we call in kind. You know, they would furnish locations, they would host an event. Sometimes they would even agree to be a presenter if it was in an area where there was an archaeologist or a historian or someone who could speak to the subject area.
So what have been some of your favorite Iowa Archaeology months, or what sticks out in your memory as being a really fun year?
Well, I'm trying to think of a fun year. I think more in terms of projects, and it probably has to do with topics. We did one on the Iowa one year, and our poster had to do with the Iowa. And
with the No Heart map, that's still a really popular
No Heart
poster.
map. And that was one where we also got some grant funding to bring that No Heart map to Iowa. It actually came to campus twice, and it. The second time, I believe, it happened to be brought in when the films were first being done by the Rundles on the Iowa. And that project, that topic, just left so much open because the Iowa are a known people, and yet they have an archaeological footprint. And there has been a lot of written historical work surrounding them. And we have their own perspective. We have descendant Iowa who come, Lance Foster, for instance, who you'll have. Mildred Motweddle, who was an Iowa girl who became very well known because she connected archaeological remains that we know of as the Oneota tradition with the earlier history of the Iowa and the Oto peoples. That year, we brought in her son to give a presentation. And so that year just let a lot of avenues open up for looking at how we know about the Iowa through their own history, through archaeology, through ethnohistory, through historical records, through this fabulous map. And I still think there's so much potential with that map. So that was a really fun one. Fort Atkinson was another one. And as an we focused on Fort Atkinson. There were projects that were going on largely through funding that the State Historical Society received. But we got some additional funding from the, it's just gonna slip my mind for a minute. But anyway, we got some additional funding so that we could host a teacher workshop at Fort Atkinson. And it was actually, they had done one the previous year, and it allowed teachers to come in and learn from all sorts of experts on Fort Atkinson about how we know about the history of Fort Atkinson. So again, it allowed us to bring in the archaeologists who'd worked at Fort Atkinson or who knew about it, the historians who knew about the written history. We had folks come over from the Ho-Chunk tribe in Wisconsin and talk about Fort Atkinson in relation, obviously, to their history. And then we had these teachers go out and do a little archaeology, do a little historic documentation, even make recommendations for what could be done at the fort to make it a more interesting interpretive place as well. Again, the local community, Al and Luann Becker and Fort Atkinson were so instrumental in that project. But it was a wonderful teachers workshop. It was just fabulous, but it all fit in with that kind of overall theme where people were doing work up there, not us necessarily, although we did do work up there that year, but the Historical Society and the local folks as well. So those two, I think, were kind of favorites of mine.
Yeah, and there's still products from
Yes.
those Iowa Archaeology Months that we use frequently in our office, especially the teaching trunk.
Exactly. And I went on to mention that we did an Iowa, you've done, I think, the Iowa teaching trunk. But
in development.
Yes. And the Fort Atkinson one, which Cherie largely put together,
Yes.
that all came out of that Fort Atkinson project.
Yeah.
So yeah, and then we held a teacher workshop even out at, at the Herbert Hoover Library that was basically on the Fort Atkinson project as well. So there were just all sorts of kind of things that happened during the month, during the year, and then afterwards as well. but it's that funding piece is big. I mean, and you
Yeah,
can't just go to one place and, pull in the money for that.
that's
So
true. And that funding is critical, but it also shows that in 2020, I'm still using these products that from those grants. So it is enduring.
correct. That's exactly right. And that was deliberate as well. It was to make something that would be lasting, that would be a contribution, that would continue to teach about what archaeology is and what is the value of archaeology to our understanding of the past. And that, to me, is the goal of archaeology education. It is, what is archaeology and what is its value to the past? And how can it be seen as another piece of understanding the past?
Yeah, and really, you laid some incredible groundwork, and I have to thank you so much for that. You really put Iowa on the map in terms of archaeology education, and I think people still look to us for examples, which is incredible and sometimes can be stressful because of these issues that we talk about. So in archaeology education, from when you started in 1999 to when you retired, did you notice any shifts in the field or the discipline? Were there any?
Well, even though you've mentioned that there's still not a lot of positions out there, I think that in general, if you had, and you can speak to this better than I can, Elizabeth, you've been at the meetings the last few years. In general, there are more archaeology educators who are paid. It may be not their full position, but who are salaried to do archaeology education. There's not as many as I think we would have hoped to have seen 20, 21 years ago, but there are more. It's still a challenge, I think, to gain an understanding among our colleagues of what is the value of archaeology education.
Yeah.
And I think part of that issue, one piece of it, is that you're considered an educator and in a field where archaeological research, from my perspective, is the paramount value of archaeology. It's doing the research, which is what we all love to do as archaeologists, and contribute more about the past. But then you're being asked to educate about that. And sometimes I think our colleagues don't value that. I really don't. In the same way, look at teachers, how teachers have to struggle in terms of being valued for what they do. Look at the pay for teachers.
Right.
You, in my position, are much better equipped because you have both an archaeological background and you have an educator background. And it's really brokering those two fields, I think, to do the best job in archaeology education. All that education piece, I had to learn as well as I could by the seat of my pants. And I had lots of opportunities. I was able to take workshops through the office, and some of the meetings that we're familiar with, some of the organizations like Project Archaeology always, offer professional development. The SAA offers professional development. But, when I started, I wouldn't have known what a rubric was if I tripped over it in a room.
Yeah.
So it was,
I just wrote one today.
I know. So, that was very challenging for me personally. So I think today what's better is that your generation of archaeology educators are better trained to do just that, educate in archaeology.
I think we're getting there. A lot more people have taken coursework in education or working on education degrees on the side.
Yeah.
And there is still a lot of archaeologists who are putting themselves out there and engaging with the public. And then there's also, of course, this movement now in archaeology education where we're like, okay, so we're doing this and we've been doing this work, but what impact does it have?
Exactly.
And so we're trying to learn how to do assessment and evaluation. And it's wonderful when archaeologists are engaging the public and doing outreach. It's also sometimes a little bit challenging for archaeology educators to say, do you understand learning styles or constructivism or assessment? Like do you know how to meet your audience where they're at? And it's kind of a circus. Like we have to be a lot of things to a lot of different people. And it's almost like reinventing skills every single year. It's like, okay, we've got the archaeology skills. Now we're learning how to be educators.
Yes.
Okay, we're educators. Now we have to learn how to do assessment and evaluation.
That's right.
which is another, it takes more time and it takes more funding. And then in today's world, now we're on social media. So now it's like, okay, Elizabeth, learn how to do really engaging social media. And now we have a pandemic. Okay, learn how to do it digitally.
That's right. And you do it, and you're doing it really well, I have to say. I'm so glad I got out when I did. But no, there were those things, especially the social media, and even some of the aspects of education that you're talking about. I did not have to do much of. We were beginning to try and figure out how we were going to assess the results of what we were doing, because it's, again, what are the ways that we can show that we're of value to the profession of archaeology, but also we're of value to education as well. And those are two different, pretty vastly different things.
Yeah.
And I felt from almost the beginning that in terms of making a real impact in education, besides doing what project archaeology does, which is something we've both worked on, and showing how relevant we are across the curriculum, it seemed that if we could have archaeology institutionalized in the schools so that there were curriculum that was accepted at a state level, which doesn't happen in many states. There are no state curricula, or at the district level. But it's always seemed to me a bit of a fight when we're doing teacher workshops. I always used to call it the point of light approach. This year we get 20 teachers to take the workshop. Next year, maybe we don't even get to have a workshop. 10 years from now, if we look at Iowa, what does that look like? How many teachers from that approach are really able to take some really good materials? I mean, they are overwhelmed, as you know, with what they have to teach anyway. And I think in terms of the archaeological profession, I think that's a really hard sell for many archaeologists, academic archaeologists, or even CRM, and I don't want to make them sound like they aren't academic. They are, but because they don't really see the value in it unless it affects them directly.
So there's a lot of project-based education and outreach, as you've mentioned, but then we talk about this a lot on a national level. We have this archaeology education family, and you're part of it and I'm part of it, and we get together a couple times a year and we talk about this. But what would it look like to you to know that our colleagues at large across the country value archaeology education?
Well, I think if they could see that it was, and we haven't figured it out yet, if it was being adopted in the K through 12 educational system. I think of a state like Texas, which teaches history every year, and they have that fabulous Texas Beyond History website. I always wish we could have something like that in Iowa. I think if we could get archaeology into K through 12, that would look visible to our colleagues, if nothing else, because they probably have kids that go to school, but it would have to be in a much bigger way than we're doing it now. And the other way is, we've always said, and you and I talked a little bit, when people first started, and I won't say first, I'll say, in the early 90s, there were already people who were effectively doing archaeology education at that point. But way back, even in the 70s, after the historic preservation movement got going, and people used to say, if the public doesn't value what archaeology is, what archaeological sites are they going to vote for the funding for it? Is the funding going to be there?
Yeah, we're still asking that.
That's right. And so I still think that is a sell. If somebody thought that their funding was going to be cut, if the CRM work was going to go away because the legislation was going to go away and there was no public outcry that, hey, this is important to save our past for the future, or maybe your position at the university was going to be looked on a little bit, maybe not so critical when budget cuts came, and I know universities don't work quite like that, but maybe you would consider it a little bit more important if the public was educated about the value of archaeology. And like I say, I felt we did a good job with taking solid research and presenting really good stuff to the public.
Right, and the research is really meant to be shared with the public. The public pays for a lot of it.
That's exactly right.
So in a perfect world, we'd be a line item in every single project budget.
And we tried. We have tried. I'm sure you have tried. We have tried. We tried.
Everyone's tried across the country.
That's
We've
right.
trying.
Yeah, and the question is, how come it never becomes institutionalized in those programs? And I have a feeling it's because the money is tight and it has to go.
The money is tight, and I still think that sometimes it's perceived as an add-on or a nice to have. It's nice to have some education. It's nice to do an engagement project, but when funding gets tight, it's one of the first things to get cut.
Right. That's like art and music.
Yeah. We've got a lot of hellos. Melody Pope is saying hi. Mary De La Garza, Sarah Horgan, Crystal Alegria, lots of our old friends.
Oh, my friends.
Yeah, this is wonderful.
Yeah.
So aside from archaeology education, you've also done a lot of archaeological research in Iowa. So looking back, what are some of your favorite highlights or favorite projects?
Well, in terms of my own stuff, anytime I get to work on a late prehistoric site, an initial Middle Missouri site in Northwest Iowa, which is where they are, Mill Creek stuff, and extensions out in South Dakota, of course, years before, because they're such rich, interesting sites. And and I'll go back to another couple of others, but I'll parlay that into one of my favorite accomplishments. And that was taking the work that had been done in the Luss Hills, and hi, Melody, you were part of that. And taking the research that the OSA did and the nominations that were being prepared out of that Luss Hills project. And there were nominations prepared on sites for the Nebraska phase materials. Hi, Kitty. And Cindy did those nominations. And then I was able to take, with a lot of work that other people had done, and write up the
Gonna let him do his thing.
Yes, you do. He's very welcome. Write up the National Historic Landmark nomination on the Kimball Village site.
Yeah, that was pretty recent.
And have it go all the way, have it become a landmark in Northwest Iowa. And that just had, first of all, it took my best love of Midwestern archaeology, which is that initial Middle Missouri Plains, Mill Creek stuff, and a fabulous site, and have it taken all the way into a semi-protected, as far as the national landmark is protected, but certainly recognized. That was very gratifying, the whole thing, writing it up and collaborating and delivering it to Washington and all of that. I have really enjoyed being able to be a crew member even on some of the projects that Cindy Peterson has done, because she's often working on those sites that are very early historic in terms of literate written records. Like the Iowaville a few years ago, Fort Atkinson. Those were just fun because of the time period they represent, and the fact that we have so many lines of resources to work with in studying sites like that. Yeah,
and you wrote, two books on Iowa archaeology, the Archaeological Guide to Iowa and Iowa's Archaeological Past. And they really highlight an incredible chronology of archaeology and history in Iowa. And I don't think a lot of people understand how pretty amazing Iowa is. So we do, of course, hear from a lot of people like, well, it's not Egypt, it's just Iowa. What here is actually incredible, but it's pretty amazing.
Well, and I think part of that, which is, everybody is aware, is that there's a lot that's below the ground. And so people can't see what's below the ground.
It's hard to feel connected to the invisible.
It is. That is right. That's right.
So you mentioned Mildred Motweddle before, and Cherie told me to ask you about her because you've done some in-depth research on her. So can you tell me a little bit about her? She sounds pretty fascinating.
Well, thank you to say in-depth. It wasn't terribly in-depth, but and it was partly when we were doing, the year we did Iowa Archaeology Month on the Iowa. Mildred was from Iowa. She was from Marengo, Iowa, and she got her undergraduate degree at the University of Iowa, which was State University of Iowa at that time. Her father was a journalism professor and went on to become the head of the journalism program at the University of Missouri, and he won a Pulitzer Prize for a publication that he did. And so Mildred was an only child, and I think she was inspired in terms of the work she did, in terms of her academic aspirations by her father. I went through a lot of her letters that she wrote to her father and mother. She's very close to both of them, and she wrote very sweet letters to her mother. But anyway, after she got her undergraduate degree at Iowa in history, she went on to the University of Chicago. And it was there that she was mentored by a couple people that helped set the trajectory of her career. I am not going to name names because I can't remember them right now, but one of the things that she learned while she was there was historical criticism. And she applied that in all the work that she did. She had a number of archaeological projects that she took part on in terms, including a couple in the Webster City area in Iowa. But she really was interested in what the historic documents might tell about Native peoples in the Midwest. And so she looked at those documents. She advocated and for always looking at them in the original language that they were written in. So she translated French documents, she translated Spanish documents, and she looked at those in terms of, as I said, what the historical records, when looked at with a critical eye of the context of those records, could tell about earlier peoples. And she really was one of the people who linked the historic Iowa and Oto peoples with the Oneota tradition. Later on in her career, early in her career, I should say, while she was still at Chicago, she met and married Waldo Wadle, who by that time worked for the Bureau of Ethnology in Washington, D.C. And so she finished her master's degree, which was this ethnohistoric approach, and identifying archaeological remains connected to Native peoples. And then she went off to live in Maryland outside of Washington, D.C., where Waldo then eventually became a fellow at the Smithsonian Institute. And she continued to do some research. She had a quote one time where she said she'd just as soon do solid research as that was as important to her as getting a degree. So even though she was on a PhD trajectory at Chicago, she did not finish her PhD. Waldo had some service in the war, stateside. They had 3 children. And even though she did, she sort of worked at some things in the 40s and 50s that relayed to her historic archaeology interest, it wasn't until her children were almost raised that she came back sort of in more concerted way and had a position at the Smithsonian. Part of the time it was an unpaid position, but she continued at that point to publish and to follow up with the interest that she'd had with the historic records and Native peoples. And later on, she was called upon as basically a witness to help some of the tribes with land claim cases, showing that this site was connected with their people in the past. And that was directly related to the research interest that she had had from the time she entered graduate school. So she's a Carrie Chapman Award winner in Iowa. She's in the Hall of Fame, excuse me, in Ames. And she made a major contribution, particularly in that area of ethnohistory and early American Indian history. I think she's also, from reading about her, I think she also represents women kind of in the field at that time. There were choices that she made, and I have to say they were choices to raise her family in the 40s, and to, Waldo's career was the one that, was the one that got a lot of accolades early on. And she, I would say, took a sidekick position, and I know what that is like. I felt like a sidekick to my first husband in many ways. And that was, I think, those were decisions she made. But she made major contributions. I also think she's a good example of probably a lot of women in the 40s and 50s and even 60s.
Yeah, and even later, a lot of what she was dealing with, the juggle between career and raising a family. So many women in archaeology have juggled that. You've juggled that.
That's right. And I do think today that it is, it's more equal between partners who are raising a family together in the field. Not always, but I think the expectations societally are that, we'll say, the dad or the male partner, should be taking more of a role, if not an equal role in that. And I certainly think that has changed since I first started to school myself.
And I think when you started studying archaeology, the field was predominantly male, or more male dominant. Yeah. And now I think archaeology has more females actually getting degrees and coming out. But there's still challenges as a woman. So is there any advice that you have for young women who are just early career archaeologists, or just getting going?
Well, here's one, and I don't know if this is, well, here's what I'll just say. I think if you can get your PhD, you should go do it. I think if you can get that PhD, it gives you a legitimacy among colleagues in your profession, and also within, if you're in a university setting, absolutely, definitely. I mean, obviously not everybody wants to do that, but I think if that's where you see yourself going, fight as hard as you can to get that done.
And to get funding for it, yeah.
Yes, and I think, even when I was in grad school, even in 10 years, there was a difference in the funding available. When I started in grad school, it was really pretty decent at the University of Wisconsin where I was. 10 years later, that had all changed in many ways. So, I mean, that sounds very narrow, but I have always found that in some instances, I felt that we could have brought a little bit more, I'll call it prestige, that maybe isn't the word, but to what we were doing if we had had a PhD behind the position. I also just think that whatever you do, you really need to go at it as concertedly as you can and as seriously as you can. I think one of the things that happened in my own career is that I felt like I got stretched pretty thin. Sometimes I wish I'd just stuck with fish bones. I could have just been just a super expert in fish bones. And yet, I don't regret the positions I had, whether they were teaching positions, whether that was archaeology education, but it often required me to have to do things I did not feel comfortable in terms of skill sets in doing. And I remember one project, I was in tears by the end of the project because I just felt like, I don't really know what I'm doing here. I'm having to do it. But
sort of imposter syndrome. Yeah, we all get it.
That's right. So I would say, if you can be as confident in an area, doesn't have to be an area, as possible, try to really hone your skills in that area. It's really difficult in archaeology anyway. We know no archaeologist is the master of all trades, but if you can really feel confident in a couple of areas while you're getting your education and your training, I think that helps you have confidence in other areas as well.
Yeah. And I would also add, especially, college is different from when I was in college, 20 years ago, and in grad school 10 years ago, but being a strong writer, just having strong written communication skills. Yeah. It doesn't seem like it's applicable to archaeology, but it's incredibly applicable to archaeology. And if you've got those strong written skills and you understand who you're writing to, that's a natural leap in that education and outreach.
I would say absolutely. And it really is. It would be nice if that was true for all archaeologists writing for whomever they're writing. Yeah. But I absolutely agree with you. And I always felt very lucky because I always liked to write. I started making up stories about people in other countries when I was a little girl, just because I was kind of interested. And so writing always came easy. And look what you need it for in the field we're in. Look at all those grants you have to write. Or summaries.
Yeah, sometimes grant feels like writing a mini thesis.
That's right. And that never bothered me, the writing part of it. I wasn't all that crazy about grant writing, but writing them was not an issue. Now having to come up with the budget and, all of the other things.
And of not knowing whether or not you're going to get the money.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And often because those grants, as you know, are not to fund your position. They are to fund that project. There are
Yeah.
very few grants that come with funding for the person who's in charge.
Very few have any sort of salary support.
That's right.
Yeah.
So you have a project you have to do. Your grants are for largely projects, and they can help keep other staff assisting and being able to do good work. But yeah, so I would say, I used to sell people patience. I still think patience is a virtue in archaeology in lots of ways. But I would say kind of overall, I regret I did not finish my doctorate. I regret it. I do regret it. And I see ways that it would have been beneficial to what I was doing, but also beneficial to me and what I might like to do.
Yeah. We've got more hellos from Sam Davis, Kelly Rundle, Joe and Cherie Arts, Luann Hudson.
Wow.
I'll ask you one more question before we take questions. So there's a couple of questions in the queue already, but if anybody else has a specific question for Lynn, type it in the comments so we can see it.
Okay.
Lynn, I don't think you're originally from Iowa, are you?
No.
So
I married in.
Through the work that you've done in Iowa, what are some of the more off the beaten places in Iowa that you've come to love, that you got to know through doing archaeology and outreach work?
Well, Northwest Iowa. I'd have to pick that above everything. And not that it's real isolated, but it's just a part of the state I think is beautiful. And we did a lot of work, done a lot of work up that way. So I would say, because we were even down in almost the Southwest together. I didn't know anything about the Luss Hills or Southwest Iowa, except for some of the education projects we did. So, there are lots of very nice places, but Northwest is probably my favorite.
Yeah, and we stayed at that beautiful house with the vineyard. Yeah, that was just a super fun trip. And then we also went to the Glenwood area in Southwest Iowa. Yeah. And I'm still raving to people about the Glenwood Archaeological Preserve that you took me to. And we did the walk around the beautiful paved trail, and you can see the indentations of earth lodges. When people are asking for things to do along I-80, I'm just like, go to Luss Hills, Council Bluffs, Glenwood Archaeological Preserve. Yeah. It's pretty amazing. And yeah, that was a nice walk with you.
Yeah. And again, that was another project that was, basically out of, Melody headed up that Luss Hills project. So there was a lot of work done in relation to that Glenwood Preserve. And it became a preserve in part as a result of that research and the work, even the outreach we did there. So.
Yeah, definitely go take a walk there if you're listening. So Joe Arts mentioned that you were on the ground floor with Project Archaeology as well when that first started. And then so he's wondering if you can give some examples where you could tie archaeology to the curriculum.
Well, Joe, you've got Cherie sitting there with you. She could answer this question. Archaeology is, always start with the spiel of archaeology it uses science and the methods of science to teach about the past, which is social studies and geography and history. I have a little dig out here for my grandson. We're going to start with maps. We're going to talk about maps. And then we're going to talk, we've already done a little project that has to do with time. What is time? These are all aspects of science and social studies that children are taught from kindergarten on. You can apply archaeology too. So
it's interdisciplinary. Really,
absolutely.
you can use it to teach everything. And I, in the last couple of years, I did a project for Science Friday where I wrote a lesson for their website, and I did not go into it thinking, because math is not my strong subject, but it ended up being a math lesson, which really surprised me that I wrote a math lesson for one. But what I learned through the Educator Collaborative is that data analysis is a really hard topic for teachers to teach. It's an incredibly important skill, but teachers don't know how to teach it well. And so the lesson I created ended up being about collecting the data and then analyzing that data and interpreting it. So,
well, setting up hypotheses, that's something I think that's real easy to do with archaeology. We've got really good stuff in archaeology to teach those aspects of the curriculum, really interesting things. So you can pick a topic like math and find a way to do it through archaeology that's very engaging. And that's not always the case, I think.
Yeah, and of course, Project Archaeology focuses a lot on social studies, but in almost all of their lessons, they give examples of other subjects that the lesson can apply to. There's a lot of data, a lot of charting.
That's right. Classification.
Yeah, so Bill Green is talking about Act 31 in Wisconsin. And that's where Wisconsin teachers are supposed to integrate teaching about Native Americans in their curriculum. And I did a wonderful, wonderful Act 31 teacher workshop with in Black River Falls a couple years ago with David O'Connor. And has anything like this been set up in Iowa?
Not that I'm aware.
It hasn't.
No, and we did work at a couple of different times with educators, I would say at a higher level. Don't ask me to recall who they were or what level, but beyond like a district level, talking about curriculum that might emanate from the state. And my understanding, and this may all have changed, I mean, I don't know in Iowa how easy it is to get a statewide standard that specific set up. I'd have to just plead ignorance on that. Earlier, it did not seem to be too possible, but that may have changed. Wisconsin's had some great stuff on Native American source material for the schools for even since, when I was there.
Mary asks, considering your legacy, what are you the most pleased with?
Gee, what's my legacy?
Mary throwing a stumper in there.
Yeah, she sure did. What am I most pleased with?
Your friendship with Mary, obviously.
Yeah, Mary, there you go. Yeah. I had some very nice friendships from Iowa. I am pleased that in the time that I had there and with the books, that I think that we did some good work in showing the potential of Iowa's past to the public. It may not have always gotten into sort of in an institutional way into the schools or whatever, and that would have been a nice thing to have seen happen. But I think that that we really did bring the good work that was being done across the state by OSA and by others, and a lot of people did appreciate that when, either through the books. That was probably the most broadcast way of doing it. So I'm proud of those books. I know there's some issues with some of them, but yeah, I'm proud of them.
They're great. Steve DeVore likes that you mentioned fish bones. He said he once asked you to look at the fish bones from the Cribs site.
Did I? I don't remember doing that. Oh, did Nancy Osborne work on that? Ask Steve if Nancy worked on it.
I don't know. Steve says he asked you. He didn't say that you did, but.
Well, Nancy Osborne, and I don't know if she worked on that, Nancy Osborne Johnson, she sent me some fish bones and she didn't have any money and they weren't that large of a sample. So I said, okay, I'll do them. I did them. And then I got this beautiful bouquet of flowers. At that time in my life, I'd probably gotten 5 bouquets of flowers. So I've always told her that was the best kind of reimbursement on that project I could have gotten. But yeah, I don't know that I don't remember even what project they were from. Crib should have probably had quite a few fish bones, but yeah, don't remember. Yeah, we had some fun with Steve DeVore out doing some geophysical work too. I've had lots of fun in Iowa. Yeah.
And then this probably will cover up our faces a little bit, but it's just a comment from Joe. He first met you back in 1980, and you're not Bob's sidekick. You were involved in the excavations.
Well, Joe, part of that's right. Yes, I was a sidekick, and I was happy to be a sidekick. He already had 7 years on me, so I'd have to take the sidekick bit. But yeah, the Belle Fourche project, the late prehistoric site, that was my project, and that was a fantastic site. The one I think you're thinking about in the Black Hills, the cave site, was Rock Shelter, and that was actually Bob's project. The Beaver Creek shelter, I just wrote it up, or did the best I could after he died with the materials that he left to get that into a report. But that really was his project. So, but thanks.
And maybe I should have started off with this, but what actually got you interested in archaeology in the first place? Or how did you decide that this was the career that you wanted to do?
I started out interested in peoples in other countries. Like I said, even in 3rd grade, I was writing stories about people after I'd read a book on somebody who lived in Holland. So I guess I was always kind of interested in the anthropological aspect. And like many other people in the past, my father read us an account of Tut's tomb. I wasn't born when it was discovered, but I was a little girl when he read it to me. So then I got interested. So I've always been interested in the ancient past and the past. And I was interested in writing. So when I went to college, I knew it was going to be journalism or anthropology. And I went into anthropology. And my first archaeological project was horrible. I didn't think I would ever stick with it. But then the next one was the Mitchell site in South Dakota. Mill Creek Lake in Ishmael, Middle Missouri. That was where I was married. So then I knew I was interested. I started out in Siberian studies. I was going to did some Russian translations, which was about all you could do at the time. The Soviet Union was still intact and people weren't really able to do much work there. But I went off to Wisconsin thinking I was going to study Siberian archaeology.
So you speak Russian?
No, I don't.
No.
At the time, I could get by doing some translating, and they were site reports with a lot of cognates.
Okay.
So that's, don't speak any Russian.
That's super interesting. And then, so you went to university in Wisconsin?
For grad school, yeah.
For grad school. And and I'm a Wisconsin girl also, but I never went to college in Wisconsin, but I grew up there, born and raised, and worked for the Wisconsin Historical Society for a long time.
I do remember.
Then Iowa found both of us somehow.
Yeah, well, I could say I married in. I have to say that.
It doesn't look like there's any more questions coming in, so this might be a good time to wrap it up. And again, I just want to thank you so much for participating in this. It definitely is nerve-wracking talking to the void. We can't see anybody who's watching us. It's really weird.
And we have to look at ourselves if we glance. That's not good. I feel like my head's crooked because I keep letting up.
And we got my cat walking back and forth in the background, but this is the nature of 2020. I didn't even bother coming up with a theme for Iowa Archaeology Month this year. I just called it 2020 because what else can you say?
And that says it all, 2020.
2020 says it all. Lynn, thank you so much. This is the first of a, I guess, 5-part series where we're calling this Coffee Hour. Of course, Lynn and I are the only evening ones, which is why we're drinking wine. But next week, we'll have David Gradwell being interviewed by Lance Foster. The following week, Dale Henning will be interviewed by Megan Meserl. And then we have Joe Tiffany interviewed by Cherie Hari Arts. And then the final week, Mike Perry will be interviewed by Brennan Dolan. Bill Green is saying hello. Mary saying hi.
Yeah, hi to everybody.
Lauren Ritterbush. Somebody's wondering about your work in the Orkneys.
Yeah, that was a long time ago. Yeah, those were favorite projects. I didn't bring them up, but those were before, not before I was married, because I did go back a couple times after I was married. But those were all in the 70s, and they were on. And I know Lauren went to the Orkneys when our Egyptian trip fell through one year. So it is, and I know John Dorshik has gone there, and I'd like to recommend it as a fabulous place, but I don't want it to become overrun by people visiting.
Yeah.
But for archaeology and just it's a wonderful place. Lots of great. I worked on a multi-period site on the Orkneys with a Norse component on the top, and then we ran into what was then recognized as the first Pictish house that had been identified for Scotland. And so it was really fun. And then I did some work on some other sites in Shetland, Norse, multi-period, and then did survey of some Neolithic stuff there. So yeah, great places. Yeah. We're supposed to go there this year. Trip got canceled. So
a lot of things got canceled this year. But we've come up with this wonderful way to do digital outreach. We had several people tune in and watching this tonight. The videos will now be available on Facebook and YouTube, I guess, in perpetuity for anybody who wants to watch Lynn and I gab away. I appreciate this, Lynn.
Thank you.
Taking your time.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate being asked. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Hello to everybody. It's great to hear all those names. I know, friends and colleagues.
So many friends saying hi.
Yeah.
So we're gonna wave goodbye. We're gonna end the live stream now. So thank you.
Sláinte.
Cheers.
Bye.